Perfect. All right, so we might have a few other people join us here, but let's get started to make the most of our time. So I am thrilled to have Doug and Sean here today with us. Sean is part of the Latticework, which is a blast. And we've connected a few times on all sorts of topics from leadership to family. And maybe 6 months ago already, he shared that he was releasing a new book on the Olympic volleyball team. And Doug, who's here with us today, that I'm thrilled to get to know a little bit and hear his story and learn from him. He led that effort. He was the coach. And I was sharing, I'm a pretty minimalist traveler, but the book made it with me. It's fantastic. And it came out relatively recently. It's definitely worth checking out. And yeah, we're here today to learn from the two of them. So Sean and Doug, thank you. I would love to just start with a kind of really high level overview. Doug, maybe we'll start with you and then Sean, and then we'll dive right into it.
Sure. First, it's great to be here. I appreciate this. This is sort of Sean's world, and I'm an old player and a more recent coach, and actually a more recent administrator. So happy to share. I think it's an interesting story that comes out of the Olympic world for lots of sports that aren't shared very often. We put a team together back in the late 70s. We knew that we were hosting the Olympics in 1984. USA Volleyball did not have much of a successful history internationally. And so that was going to be the first opportunity for a men's team to be in the Olympic Games for quite a while. And so we set up a training center. We did some pretty unique things in the Olympic world, I think. And we're really fortunate to have a very talented group of players, largely from two different parts of the United States, some from the Midwest and most from the West Coast. We trained together, I think, more hours than any team up to that time had ever sort of spent time together. That presented lots of challenges and opportunities. We had a kind of interesting plan, I think, for what we thought we could do. And that plan changed many times pretty dramatically. You know, we had kind of a dream come true performance at the Olympic Games. And as much as anything, I guess I'm proud of the fact that USA Volleyball has become sort of a core sport for the Olympics and in this country. And we're recognized as a leader in many respects in the world of volleyball. So that's sort of a quick overview. I think there's some interesting aspects to this story that are relevant to lots of different parts of life and business, and happy to try to share some of those.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely dig into the how it spreads outside of volleyball. But yeah, Sean, a quick intro on your side would be great too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us, and I'm really happy to be here. So I come from the leadership development, organization development world. My connection to this story is sort of interesting. My father was a team or sports psychologist. He and a partner that he works with at the time, Chuck Johnson. My father's Don Murray. Doug brought them in to work on, not so much what was going on in the court and the talent, the physical skills of the players, but how they work together, how they work as a team, what they were doing to build a culture for winning. And I'm just, fascinated by that. I've sort of followed in my father's footsteps into that same field. And several years ago, I received as a gift from my wife the book Boys in the Boat. I don't know if you guys have read that, but it's another kind of Olympic story. It was a 1936 Olympic crew team that won a gold medal at the 36 Olympics in Berlin. But I was really inspired by that story, and I thought, I'd like to write a story and really study a team that became the best in the world at what they did, and try to figure out how they did it. And when I thought through my past, this team really jumped out because I had the connection. I knew Doug through my father, and I called him up and said, hey, I'd like to learn more about that team, one thing I knew about the team is they'd been on a 3-week outward bound course as part of their training, which I found really fascinating. I didn't know much about the course when I started writing the book, but that played a part in, there were many things the team did, and like Doug said, but that was one thing that jumped out at me. You just don't hear that very often, that the Olympic team would go into the backcountry of the United States in the winter to train for volleyball, and why they did that and what the impact was. So that became a part of the story. And I learned a lot from studying the team, and I hope to kind of share a few insights today and have a great discussion. So that's kind of how I got started with the Blas.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sean. So Doug, well, my first question is sort of directed at you. Charlie Munger has this great line that extremes in outcome, good or bad, often instruct best. And I think that's why learning lessons from war, from mastery of any sorts, is really instructive. And the book kind of starts out with, in 1970, USA Volleyball was 2 places behind Mongolia in the World Championships. And 14 years later, it won gold at the Olympics. And 14 years isn't all that much time when you're talking about something that happens every 4 years. Talk to us a little bit about kind of how you're able to get a team from that to Olympic gold. You helped institutionalize the sport. You specialize things in a bunch of ways. You're also criticized for your approach. And I'd love to just hear, like, why were you criticized, and how did you have conviction to kind of help a team make that big of a leap?
Okay, maybe there's 20 or 30 questions in there. Let me try.
Yeah.
Let me try to get to a couple of them. So volleyball in the U.S. Up till 1984 was kind of a disaster. And the sport wasn't terribly popular in the US, but extraordinarily popular around the world. And so there's this very small, focused group of players, mostly in the Los Angeles area where volleyball was pretty popular, and partly because of beach volleyball or growing up on the beach and trying to make that transfer. And there wasn't any structured beach volleyball at that time either. And so there were a number of us, certainly not just me, who thought we just have to do things really differently. We're not going to be very good if we keep trying to put an international team together in the summer, train for a week or two, select a new team the next year, a new team the year after that, select a coach each year. That changes. That didn't seem to be much of a model for success. And so slowly over time, we made quite a lot of changes, many of which have been incorporated by lots of other sports in the Olympic world and outside of it. And if you look around in the United States, consistency and stability and continuity more often than not leads to success. And so we started with something like that. And, you know, both our women's team and our men's team wound up in something we called a national training center. And we developed a jobs program and a partnership with some communities that were willing to host us and that were interested in the exposure and perhaps hosting events and other reasons that communities or convention centers or any kind of entity like that might be interested. The women started in a couple of different locations. The men started in Dayton, Ohio, which was not exactly a hotbed for the sport. But we learned a lot. And I think, I don't know, two things jump out at me. One is, in my view, I don't know if I always thought this, but I certainly did during those years coaching. You have to be willing to be maybe a little bit off the wall, a little risky. You have to be willing to fail. We talk about that a lot in today's world. And I think it sets a mindset that that nothing is off the table. We're going to try to be the best. We want to be the best. And being the best doesn't necessarily mean being the best in the world. It means being the best you can be, I think. And we didn't talk a lot about winning a gold medal. We talked about we have to be really good. And to be really good, we have to compete with the teams that are really good. And how do we define them? What are their characteristics relative to training, relative to experience, relative to continuity, relative to stability, whatever, all those things. And so we were willing to do that. And then we had to have a plan. We had to put a plan together that was detailed and that saw, I use this term a lot. We want to look at the big picture. What's the big picture here? It isn't tomorrow's practice or today's practice. It's where do we want to be at the next major competition? Or where do we want to be after this season is over? Or where do we want to be in 4 years? And that was something that nobody was talking about, really, in almost any sport that I'm aware of at that time. And so willing to risk and looking at the big picture, I guess from my perspective, were sort of foundations of how we put this team together. And I'm going to say this kind of harshly, but almost any individual could be expendable. And we talked to the players about that, and frankly talked to Sean's father and the consultants, and using team building consultants. I want to call Don and Chuck sort of team building consultants, was pretty new, but they really helped us look at the big picture. You know, how do you go from here to there? You put a plan together and you define what there is. What does there mean? And so maybe I'll stop there with answering that. But I think, yeah, we sort of slowly got better and better. And we put a structure together that in today's world, I think you would use the term, we created a culture. I don't know that I remember ever using that word back in the late 70s or early 80s, although today you can hardly talk to a coach that doesn't use that word.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the foundation of what we thought was important and how we were going to be successful. And it's worked out remarkably well, I think. And I think some of those principles are still foundational to Olympic sports, certainly volleyball, and maybe professional sports. And there's incredible turmoil going on in the world of sports right now at the professional level, at the collegiate level, at the Olympic level. That's concerning, but interesting, I guess.
Yeah. So Doug, one thing that really stood out to me in the book is that process of going from here to there. My read from an outsider's perspective was it was really organic and sort of bottom up, and not something that you dictated as the coach. And the story of the book is, you know, you kind of, I think it was with Don, actually, if I remember correctly, that you sort of asked, like, you know, where do we want to be in 6 months' time at the next World Championship? And somebody just had the idea of, like, we want to beat Cuba. And at the time, that was kind of a big statement, if you will. So one, can you talk to us about, I guess, if you consider it buy-in from the team to have something ambitious, but not talking about getting a gold medal, what that process looked like. And if you do set, you know, achievable goals, obviously it didn't limit you achieving something amazing, but how do you think about that, like setting up ambitious but achievable goals versus kind of just saying, like, we're going to be the best in the world and win the next Olympics? Yeah.
So we spent a significant amount of time involved in goal setting. And I think we learned a lot about goal setting. I think we evolved what it is. And it's pretty easy to write down, you know, I can write down all kinds of statistics that I want to have as an individual player in almost any sport. And we tried to discourage the players from looking at that as this very hard achievement or failure sort of goal. But what was much more important was, if you're going to write something down and you're going to commit to it, and it's going to become public, at least within your group, you have to tell us how you're going to achieve that. What are you going to do that's going to change your behavior, or that you're going to be able to accomplish, that leads up to that end goal? And we really hated talking about an end goal as an individual. We really like talking about end goals for the group itself. So
why is that, Doug? If I can jump in really quickly, why
Yeah.
that distinction?
I think part of it was the history of our sport, you know, and part of it is just understanding the mentality of elite athletes. They get real oriented toward, I want to win a gold medal or a championship at this event, or I want to beat this team. And it's very pass fail sort of oriented. And it doesn't lend itself as easily to this process that goes on to develop the team. And we talked a great deal about that. We talked to the team a lot. It sounds like that's all we did was talk. We spent a lot of time in the gym. Yeah, one year we spent over 10,000 hours training, a lot of hours, and we played over 100 international matches. And when I was a player on our national team back in the early 70s, if we played 8 or 10 matches a year, that was a lot. So we changed things quite dramatically. But if individual goals have a process and all of them aggregate together, then the team all of a sudden has a process, or the group has a process. So maybe we talk about it as a group, because there were lots of other people involved beyond just the players. And now the common term is the team around the team. Really significant. And the stability of that group was enormously impactful, I think, to the ability of the team. And then, of course, we're ignoring the fact that we had really talented players. And you want to have, there is no replacement for talent. There is no replacement for skill, for ability, for competence, or whatever. And so, you know, Sean mentioned the outward bound. I mean, we could talk probably for an hour just about the outward bound experience, but it was a great example of thinking in a big picture way and part of the process. And that part of the process was getting the players to see each other in a different hierarchy of skill or ability or competence, take them completely out of their comfort zone, put them in a situation that they have almost universally no background in, and see who rises up in that world. That carries over back to seeing them in a bigger picture way than just, I'm the best hitter on the team, I'm the best setter on the team, I'm the best passer, server, whatever. And I suspect there'd be a whole range of response to this, but as a coaching staff, we thought it was enormously impactful. And for a couple players particularly that were really key players. So that was sort of one of the things we were willing to do and risk. And it was pretty risky. I don't know. I'm not sure how many teams could do something like that today. You'd probably have too many insurance policies to deal with that would be challenging. So I don't know if I'm addressing some of the things you're asking about, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. What else did you learn about goal setting, right? It was such a big part of your process, and it wasn't, now there's so much literature on it and you have different models, but you guys kind of had to start it from scratch in a sense. Like, what else have you learned that might seem obvious today, but at the time was novel and controversial?
Yeah, I think we learned that you don't do it one time and think you're done, that you have to have a process. And we talked very specifically about measurable things, but measurable goals in the lead up to what are you trying to get to. And as I recall, we did it 3 times a year. And please remember, we're together 12 months of the year. This group is in pretty close contact. We're practicing 6 days a week, some weeks 5 days, others. And we had pretty structured activities, even the days we didn't practice. So the team is living in the same area. We're traveling together. And it was a pretty solid core group of 16 or 17 players a different mix of those would travel each time. And so we reviewed the goals with the players 3 times a year. Where are you on this process to get to this goal? And tell us how this goal impacts the team. How is that influencing the team to be better? And then I guess I want to morph into one other topic that was hugely important. Role definition was something that I think one of my assistant coaches sort of convinced me of. You have to be able to define a person's role in your team or organization or group. And they don't have to accept it necessarily. They don't have to love it, but they do have to hear you. They do have to understand it. And so getting them to regurgitate what you said to them was pretty important. And along with goal setting, role definition was awfully important. And remember, I guess, every one of these players was an All-American and the most important player on their college team or their club team, and had never, ever been anything other than a starter in their group. And that's just part of the team dynamic, and you have to understand that. And they came from a very competitive situation against each other. So some came from UCLA or USC or Ohio State or Penn State or Stanford or whatever. And they just despise the guys on the other team, which is part of the sports culture. And to not be a starter, to not have as much playing time, and to get convinced that even if you're not on the court, you can make this team better. And how are you going to do that? And talk to me about it and put that into your goals was tough to get through and not easy for them to accept. And Outward Bound was part of that, I think, to get them to see that, again, the big picture and the process. So.
Yeah, and to highlight 2 things there, just for my own sake, to remember it a little better. I think one thing that you said that just stood out there is not only your goals, but how that attaches to the team's goal, right? So it's not kind of floating aimlessly, but there's a purpose to it, right? There's something bigger than yourself. And you started off and you said, maybe it's harsh, but it's probably correct that any one player is expendable, and the team has to know that, right? The team itself is bigger than any one person. Talk to us a little bit about that, right? Because you have All-Americans that are super achievers that are used to some level. How do you, and if it makes sense to go into Outward Bound, perfect. But how do you break that ego or get someone to sort of put the team and subordinate themselves in a big way? It's difficult, especially with people at that talent level. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a great answer to that question. I think each person, we sometimes say, all things being equal, but they never are. So we had to convince players, I think, that the most important activity that we're engaged with happens in the practice gym. We're going to get better in the practice gym. Yeah, we have to play a lot of matches and we have to compete against these teams that were way ahead of us in the world ranking and way better and have a much better history. And so having players understand this program is made up of all these parts: how we do on the court, how we do at major competitions, how we do in the practice gym every day, how you work in the weight room, how you work as a teammate off the court, how your social interaction groups may affect the team. And we encourage them to have goals that were far beyond just my statistics as a volleyball player. And volleyball is a very numbers heavy sport. So we can get printouts of the statistics from a match that's 100 pages long in all kinds of different ways. And so you can really get wrapped up in the numbers. But this was going to be a group that was together. They had to interact. They had to travel together. Who are the right roommates? how do you warm up for a match? If I warm up with you, is that the best way to do it? And all of those things could be part of their goals. All of those things could be things they could change, they could get better at. And that we tried to sort of push them in that direction to understand how we're going to make this group function at something. I don't think we use the word optimally, but that's what we're really talking about. How do we make us be, again, in today's world, we're talking about the common phrase is the best version of myself. You hear that a lot. I want to become the best version of myself. We wanted this team to be the best version of itself. And then two other things stand out to me. In sports, which is really dominated by, I think, motor learning theory, and that's more my area than anything else, is that the game kind of teaches the game. And so that doesn't mean we're only going to play the sport, but it means we're going to be very group oriented in practice. So we're going to break the sport down into parts of the game, but it's going to look like the game, and it's going to be really competitive. And we wanted the players to understand losing is just part of sports. It exists. So you can't win every activity. You can't win every touch of the ball. You can't win every drill. You can't win every match. But you can get better every time you touch the ball. You can do that. And if you take it seriously, if you have what now we would call mindful practice, that leads to more improvement. And so being competitive, understanding that winning and losing is normal and natural, you have to learn to deal with it. And you have to learn how to make it work for you, was an important part of the process and the big picture. So.
Doug, you mentioned you moved more to the administrator role these days, and if we have time, would love to hear what that looks like. But do you have any outstanding questions or regrets from your days as a coach? If we tried this, or if we only knew this, and it's kind of hard with hindsight bias and everything, but does anything spark with that question?
Yeah, I am not one of those individuals that will tell you I never regretted a thing I did in my entire life. I think I second guess myself a lot. Yeah, I say this to people all the time. I was a pretty good volleyball player. I played on our national team during that time you referred, when we were 2 positions behind Mongolia. So not very good. I think I was a much better coach. So I coached in 3 Olympics, and we won a gold medal, but we didn't win 3 gold medals. So I wasn't a perfect coach. And I think just understanding how a sport, when you're coaching it, fits into the world of the players you're involved with at that moment, their priorities, what impacts them, what influences them. I think we could all be much better at that. I'm sure I could have been much better at that. I think I had the most talented team that I ever coached that had the poorest result. I think we overtrained the team. I think we led that team to being not fresh to play at the most important events that they could have, and it was probably the most physically skilled team I ever coached. I'm not sure that '84 team was. I think it had. I think it just fit together the right way, and we were able to find the right pieces that made that team really good, which is a fascinating part of, I think, coaching a team, and how each individual can get better and better, may never start, but they impact the team. There's a guy that played on that '84 team who never started any meaningful match, was just fantastic in practice and contributed dramatically to the success of that team. And another guy made almost every traveling roster in the 4 years, and then didn't make the Olympic team, was cut. And so there's gosh, there's just so much dynamics to a team and how you get that team to perform at its best. And so I don't know. There you go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Sean, if I can turn the spotlight on you for a second, whether it's, well, yeah, let's start with that. Doug described your dad as a team consultant, which I think is a beautiful way to kind of think about that. And it's your profession too, in a big way now, which is really interesting. What have you learned in terms of, back in the day, it wasn't called culture, but now everybody knows and talks about that. But what have you learned both from your dad and your profession in terms of what it takes to build a great team?
Well, I don't know, just listening to Doug talk about those years reminds me of just how incredible the dynamics were in this story, and kind of what I learned from studying this team. And I've studied other teams obviously too, but just to kind of talk about pull a few out that I think are important to, what I've learned about building a culture, building a winning team from studying this particular part of history. And I mean, one is trust. And I know that's sort of, everyone says that, and you hear that a lot, but in the early days, as I talked to the players, like Doug said, they came from a lot of different backgrounds. There was the East Coast players and the West Coast players, even though the East Coast players were like Midwest. So there was kind of an Eastie versus Westie sort of faction on that team. There was the players from UCLA, the players from USC, the players from Pepperdine, and there wasn't the level of trust that you might need to become the best version of yourself as a team. And I think, my theory is that the spending all that time in the gym together, and then outward bound and some of those experiences led to eventually a level of trust, a certain kind of critical point of trust. And then once you reach that critical point of trust, then opportunities open up. For example, everyone understanding your role. I think that's an important part of building a team. Not everyone can be a star. It's really important in a national team like this, where everyone has been a star before. And now you get to the highest levels of the sport, and you may be on the second team, and your role may be to come in at certain points in the game and do a very specific, play a very specific role. And everyone needs to that player needs to understand their role, and everyone and embrace it and do it to their best ability. And then the other players need to respect you for that role and what you do for the team. And so getting to that level is important. And another aspect is just creativity and innovation. And I think this is really important for business today. And I know a lot of people in the Latticework are entrepreneurs and are building organizations, and creativity and innovation is really important. And I think, what I learned from this team around, once you get that level of trust and people understand their roles, you can start to experiment. And, Doug said we weren't afraid to fail. One of my favorite quotes in the book where Doug said, we weren't afraid to look foolish, is the way he put it. And I think that's really important as a leader, that, your job is to create the conditions, build the trust so that you can optimize your organization, your team for the conditions and the talent that you have. And just to give you an example of how it played out for this team, and then maybe we could, people can think about how it might work for them and your organization. But in the early 80s, the best team in the world was the Soviet Union. And Doug said that the US national team looked to the Soviets. How do we become like them? They've won 2 gold medals. They've won all these world championships. Let's copy their system in some way. Let's bring in what they're doing. And they looked at the system and they brought in a few ideas, but in reality, the players in the Soviet Union at the time were very different than these beach players. They were bigger bodies. They were very good at blocking. They weren't moving as fast. And Doug had all these agile beach players that were incredibly athletic and like to do things on the court that sort of spontaneously. And so our system didn't really fit with the Soviet system. So then they looked at the Japanese, and the Japanese had more quick, agile players, but everyone learned the sport the same way in Japan. It was very homogeneous. And And in the US, like Doug said, their players were from different parts of the country, learned different ways, and didn't really have coaches growing up. They were just learning on the beach. So they went to the Japanese coach. The coach at the time, Matsudaira, was creating all these films and giving out information about how they were able to win a gold medal. And Bill Neville, the assistant coach, was sort of amazed that they were willing to share so much about their competitor, to their competitors about how they won. And he said, well, Matsudaira said, well, only the Japanese can play like the Japanese. So it's, if you want to copy our system, go ahead, because it's probably, you're never going to be as good at this system as we are, because it's like he used the analogy of a Xerox copy machine where each generation degrades a little bit. So, go ahead, copy our system, is what he was sort of saying. And, but the light bulb went off for the American coaches, which was, we need to create a system that optimizes our talent and our abilities. And that's what they did. And I think that the trust was there to find a way to work together. And it's not like Doug or the coaches implemented top down. This is a new way we're going to play that's going to optimize how, all of our talents. It was more in the gym, trial and error, experimentation, willing to look foolish, right? Some of these aspects where they tried different ways of playing together. They did more audibles on the court, so that players had more freedom to call their plays and things like this. And they ended up creating a system which today is called the American system and is still widely used, actually. And I thought that innovative process was really, really, really fascinating, an important part of building a winning culture. But it, just I guess it really starts with leadership and understanding your principles and having values that you can draw to. And I think, what Doug was talking about as far as establishing a training center, establishing a vision, a goal, plan, all that stuff are elements that build up to creating a team. Having people understand that team success comes first over the individual. The individual is expendable is kind of a harsh way to put it, but really it's how it's done. Bill Belichick has a quote about the power of the wolf is the pack. And you hear him talk a lot about that with the Patriots. And I think that's important. One quick story around, what I call talent versus commitment. Like if you're talented, everyone was talented on this team. Not everyone was committed to the team over the individual. And there was one individual that was highly talented, many thought was perhaps the best player in the country at the time. And, Doug had certain rules about not playing in Europe professionally. I mean, it was okay if the players wanted to go play professionally, they just couldn't come back to the national team. And also not playing on the beach, because the beach was, there were a lot of tournaments on the beach, but it took a lot of effort for these players to play on the beach. They're training in the gym 5 days a week. So if they went to the beach, it was a 3-4 hour drive. They're in the sun all day. They'd come back to practice on Monday and they weren't ready to go. So he said, no more practicing, no more playing on the beach. And this particular player decided to play professionally and play on the beach and didn't end up playing on the national team. And a lot of people thought that was a crazy decision that wanted Doug fired for it, because, there was no way the US was going to win without this player. But in fact, the team got better. And because another player came in named Steve Timmons and opened up an opportunity for him, and he was committed to the team, and he ended up becoming one of the best players in US history. It won, I think, 3 or 4 gold medals, right, Steve? But yeah, anyway, he flourished. That's what happened. The team got better. Those are just kind of a few elements I've learned from studying this team and that I think apply.
I appreciate that, Sean. There's a great story from Lionel Richie that said, you can and you should master the best of those who came before you, but you become truly great when you develop your own style. And it sounds like, not only did you do that, but now everybody or others know it as the American style. It's so cool to hear that. We've hinted at it a few times, and whether it's a tag team or whoever's sort of best to answer it here, but talk to us just a little bit about the Outward Bound experience and what that did to the team, the East versus West. And I think anyone who is east of the Sierras was an Eastie, if you will. So, it shows the dominance of California in the sport. But just talk to us a little bit about what that experience did to bring the team together.
Sean,
Yeah.
you want to start or you want?
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
can set it up and then you maybe can provide some commentary. So
Sure.
a couple years into the quad, the 4 years before the LA Olympics, my father, the team psychologist and team consultants and the coaches got together and they recognized this kind of lack of trust, so to speak, or lack of cohesion. And the idea was generated that what this team needed was a shared significant life experience, something outside of volleyball where they could come together, like Doug said, see each other in a different way, break down the hierarchy of how they see each other in the gym based on volleyball ability and put them in an environment that's unfamiliar, that's going to push them in some way and allow them to be more reliant on each other for success in a way that's not involved with volleyball. And the first idea was to take them to boot camp. Actually, there's a big Marine base just north of San Diego, and they contacted the Marines, and the Marines said, no, we're not going to send your volleyball team through boot camp. So that was a no-go. And they ended up reaching out to Outward Bound, which is a international organization. Many of you may be familiar with it, but it's designed to sort of build resilience for individuals, allow people challenges in the taking them on challenges in the outdoors and in the wilderness, where they learn about themselves and also in a group setting and learn how to work together as a group and have empathy for one another and take care of one another. And that's what they did. They reached out to Outward Bound. Outward Bound designed a course specifically for this team. It was 3 weeks in the middle of winter in Utah. And it was January of 1983. The temperatures were really cold. It was 100 miles all in. And the players were carrying 70-pound packs. They were snowshoeing. It was pretty harsh conditions, even more harsh than I think the designers of Outward Bound thought they were going to put this team into. And they went up over, they started about 4,000 feet, went up over 11,000 feet in elevation, and it got to about 5 degrees Fahrenheit at night a couple of times. I looked at the weather records. And so what happened was they were dependent on one another, because each night to set up camp, someone would have to clear out the snow, someone would have to put the tents up, someone's gathering firewood, someone is preparing the meal, and together they're going to survive the conditions and get ready for the next day and go. And when they're traveling, someone's pushing, breaking trail, right, and working harder out front, and then that person goes to the back of the line, and they did it together. And over the course of 3 weeks, something changed around how they viewed each other, and there was a lot of interesting, little stories, sub stories in that 3 weeks. But they came out of that, and I think that was something that helped them get to that critical point in trust. But anyway, that's kind of the foundation. I don't know, Doug, if you want to add maybe some commentary to what you got out of the experience or what you saw.
Yeah, as I said, we could probably talk about the Outward Bound experience for forever. Yeah, we thought that we needed to do something dramatic to generate, enhance the culture and make this team cohesive. And we did talk about a lot of ideas. And honestly, I think initially I was sort of taken aback when Chuck and Don suggested this, and one of my assistant coaches was really pushing hard for this. And it took a while to sell me on it. And then, of course, we had a pretty interesting couple of weeks or month to sell the team on it. I don't think any team I'd ever heard of had ever done anything like this. And certainly it was the first time Outward Bound, at least they told us, this is the first time they'd ever created a program for a sports team.
Doug, can I ask one quick question here?
Sure.
So you mentioned having to do something dramatic. Just lay a little context for us there. Like, was the team infighting a lot? Does it just take something dramatic to bring people together where they just trust each other 100%? Like, why
Sure.
something dramatic?
Yeah, I think both of those things were true. We thought the team should be playing more consistently good. I think most coaches would tell you, and I think individuals in other areas would say, we want to be good over time. We don't want to have this blip of a wonderful performance here and then a terrible performance the next day. And, you're not going to win championships that way. You're not going to be good over time. And then the other thing that's, I think, makes coaches comfortable is having some level of confidence in how the team will play every day they walk out on the court or every match. So again, it's not this up and down performance all the time. And, did Outward Bound contribute to that? I don't know, but we won 30 matches in a row leading into the Los Angeles Olympics. We got to a point where we were playing at the level that we thought we could play at. And I think a big part of that was this evolution of trust, this seeing people in a different way than simply their ability as a volleyball player on the court. And Outward Bound contributed to that. There was a specific case that's very reflective of that. So we had an important player, but had very little impact outside of his own position on the court, very little influence on the other players. Wasn't enormously popular, wasn't respected, except he was very good at one or two parts of the game. So I don't want to get really technical here. And on Outward Bound, this individual became the most skilled at rock climbing and belaying teammates. And everybody wanted him to be on the rope when they were climbing. And all of a sudden, his influence and his impact on the team changed dramatically. And he also was really good every night around a campfire cooking and articulating what went really well that day, what didn't. So we hiked 12 miles or whatever the figure was. Could we have gone a better route? Could we have distributed the things we were carrying more evenly? It was really, it was a big moment for that player. And there were other examples of that. We had some players who were the most respected as a player, the most integral part of the team, who didn't carry the weight they should have on that trip. And so we had this leveling, I think, of respect and perspective of individuals. And it was on a whole really positive from my perspective, I think from the staff's perspective. And it was hard. I mean, Chuck Johnson, that we've mentioned a couple of times, was probably 20 years older than anybody else, 25 years old. He went on that trip. He was trying to carry the same amount of weight as these 22, 24-year-old, really wonderful athletes. And so we had a couple players who would every day offer to take some of his weight, and that was positive. And then we did some orienteering without some guides, and we did a 2-day solo. Every player went off and wrote some thoughts about how they could influence this group and what were their important skills. And so lots of byproducts of this experience. And it was physically challenging in an environment. Just basic physical challenges are pretty easy for elite athletes. So you can take them out of their comfort sport and put them in another sport. They can do the physical stuff. But we had some players that had spent almost no time in the snow, had never camped out and set up tents, built campfires, cooked. We had a half a dozen players who, on the day we left, had brought 10 rolls of toilet paper with them. That was all left behind. They had brought 20 candy bars. Those were all left behind. We had to carry out everything that we took in. It was just a completely unique experience, and I think really positive for the team at a time not quite in the middle of this quad, but getting closer to decision making of how we were really going to be at the Olympic Games. And yeah, there was a lot of risk here. I mean, we had some people, myself included, who wound up with what's it called? Not frostbite, but frost nip, that didn't get feeling back in their fingers and toes for a couple of weeks after that. I was thinking, I'm going to get sued here. I'm going to be, the biggest pariah in the Olympic movement, because I'm going to cause players to lose their fingers and toes. And anyway, fortunately, it didn't happen. We all recovered, and the story ends well. But one of the things also about that trip is the players understood, I think, maybe more acutely than we could ever demonstrate in words or in the practice gym. Hey, these coaches will do anything to try to make this team good. They'll do anything. They're crazy. We need to kind of buy into this in a different way. And they did. And they did it in a remarkable way. I want to add one other thing. In my view, a coach's job is to kind of push players in many respects to go where they don't necessarily think they can go, or that they haven't experienced that they can get there. How do you get there? But ultimately, at least in a team sport, and I think in a business and in a group setting, the leader establishes sort of the overall context, but the players, or the workers, the members of this group, they're going to decide if this is going to be a great team, how far they're going to go. The players did that, and it was more evident after the Outward Bound experience than before. They really took charge of this team. For sure, I'm never going to underestimate or downplay the role of a coach, but it was really important for the players to take ownership. Hey, we want to be great, and we're willing to buy in and do whatever it takes to be great. And that also, I think, came out of Outward Bound, and it was great. It was a positive outcome, and the team got much better, and we were able to do things that I think we wouldn't have been able to do without that experience.
Thank you for sharing. We could go on forever, but I am mindful of time. Sean and Doug, is there anything you want to make sure that we do touch on in these last 4 or 5 minutes that we have here? If not, I have a dozen more questions we can rely on, but I just want to make sure that we do touch on anything that might be top of mind.
I just want to, respond to whatever anybody might have a question about or want to bring up. So,
okay. Sean, anything on your end?
The only thing I might add is that what Doug was just saying there around leadership coming from the players, and you think about a CEO being a leader, maybe like a coach, and the executive team or the employees of an organization being sort of like the players, if you use that analogy, that at some point on a great athletic team, there's a leadership that comes in from the player level. And Sam Walker wrote a great book called The Captain's Class. I don't know if you've read that one, Blas, or if anyone on the call has, but he looked at the most dynastic, teams of all time, like the Hungarian soccer team in the 50s and the All Blacks and several All Black teams of New Zealand, and just the Celtics in the 60s, the Patriots in the last 20 years. They all had a captain or someone who stepped up and set a higher level standard of what was expected. And I think this team is in the same league as those dynasties. And it was a certain leadership that came. One player, Karch Karai, comes to mind as being a player that really mentally had a focus and had a high standards of himself, and then held other people to that standard. And he went on as the captain because the team went on to win a World Cup, another World Championship, another gold medal in '88. So for about 6 years, it dominated the world. And but there was another player named Chris Marlowe who also brought that. He wasn't there for the whole dynasty. He was just there for '84, but he brought a certain charisma and leadership to the team, even though he wasn't a great player on the court. And I think there's a role for people like that in organizations too, that maybe they're not the best coder or the best salesperson, but they are there to help make the team better. And you got to recognize those people.
Thanks, Sean. Doug and Sean, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we hardly scratched the surface here, but we'll take what we can get in an hour, I guess. But this was amazing. The ideas around everyone being subservient to the team and how do you instill that, and the goal setting process is something else I'll remember from this. But thank you both for your time. Again, the book is If Gold is Our Destiny. It's wonderful. There's so much to learn from teams that accomplish mastery to that level, especially from a relatively low base. And Doug, what you accomplished is amazing. And I'm sure there's no words to describe what that feels like in hindsight, but thank you for trying. And Sean, thank you for writing the book. This is great.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, boss.
Yeah, so much fun. And thank you all for joining on the call. Hope it was worthwhile, and we'll talk soon.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.